welcome to each of you. It's great to be here. My script is not scrolling, and so I may have to make up the rest of this if they do not push the right button on the other screen. But we are super excited to have each of you here to witness Mike Becker's presentation, The Power of Zero, the fourth in our 5-part summer speaker series, which also includes Social Security planning, taxes in retirement, Roth conversions, and long-term care planning. As we get started, I want to say a little bit about where this came from. After working with clients to take care of their health insurance, Medicare, and group insurance needs, we found that more and more of our clients were asking about things that were impacting their decisions. Things like inflation, Social Security, when to retire, if they could retire, how to pay for things, whether it's long-term care or leaving a legacy. While I am a recovering financial advisor, I no longer practice in many of these areas. I do still understand the impact that they play on our clients' decisions and lives. As we have partnered with many financial advisors for a long time, we look to those advisors to help us present information on these topics. Today's presentation, Power of Zero, is presented by Mike Becker of Legacy Financial Partners. Mike Becker has been in the financial services industry for over 27 years. He started in the financial services industry right off the college campus. After 6 years of running his financial planning business, he transitioned into sales management. For 18 years, Mike was a frontline manager located in Minnesota, focusing on teaching financial planning to financial professionals. In 2021, Mike decided to start a family financial planning business called Legacy Financial Partners, LLC. Legacy Financial Partners works with Securities America, Futurity First Insurance Group, and Senior Market Sales, providing his clients financial solutions. Mike specializes in building and implementing financial plans for busy families and helping retirees with their retirement income plan. Mike speaks on many different financial topics, including Social Security, taxes in retirement, and long-term care. Mike's recent article on Social Security was published on over 250 news platforms. When Mike is not working, he enjoys golf, Wisconsin Badger football, and that's a healthy rivalry with me, and chasing his 3 young kids around the house, the golf course, and the ball fields. Mike has been married to his wonderful wife, Anna, for 15 years. At the end of today's presentation, we will have an opportunity for Q&A, so stick around for that. Send your questions via the chat at the bottom to host and panelists. Alexander and Haberman does not practice in any of the specialties of its speakers, but welcomes them here to speak for the educational benefit of our clients, friends, and guests. Alexander and Haberman is a specialty firm focused on assisting with Medicare Advantage, supplements, and Part D plans, as well as individual and family health insurance on and off the exchange, and other benefits, including health, dental, and vision. Now, to get us started with today's presentation, it is my honor to introduce Mike Becker.
Thanks, Joshua. I appreciate that warm introduction as always. It's great to be back with you all and your wonderful team, your clients, your friends, to talk about this topic of the power of zero tax planning strategy. It's great to see a lot of friendly names who've seen our presentations in the past, and welcome back. And for many of the new names, welcome for the first time. Hopefully you'll take something away from these conversations. We tend to really make these workshops education-based, so we're hoping that you'll take a few things away today. And as Joshua said, when questions come up, feel free to chat them right off. We'll get to those questions at the very end, and we'll make sure that we answer those in a good, solid Q&A. Let's start with some disclosures. I'm not affiliated with the federal government, IRS, or any other governmental agency, nor am I a CPA. I'm a local financial advisor that talks and teaches about these topics and helps people prepare for their financial retirement. So like Joshua said, this is our 4th in our summer series of workshops, starting with Social Security back in June. Taxes and retirement really set the stage for today's conversation. Roth conversions last month, of course, we have the power of zero. And then next month, we'll have our long-term care hybrid conversation. So you'll have a chance to get recordings at the very end of this presentation as well. So we're going to start out with a quiz. This is something that I don't normally start presentations out with, but we do also like to do polling questions in our Zoom calls. We'll do about 3, maybe 4 of those throughout the session just to create some engagement, have some fun. So we appreciate everybody participating and going ahead and confidentially chiming in. So here's our pop quiz. What's the highest tax bracket our country's ever seen? What's the worst it has ever been from a tax perspective? If you go ahead and hopefully the poll question is popped up, there it is. And you can see the 4 different answers from 94 to 70, 50, 40. And go ahead and just choose what you think is the highest tax rate or the worst it's ever been. And when we have the answers, we'll flash those up here in just a moment. But what's the worst it's ever been? It was actually 94%. All right, awesome. We've got a lot that shows a lot of diversity, but 94%. Thank you, everybody, for participating in the poll, by the way. We appreciate that. At the end of World War II was 94%, 44, 45. And at that time, anybody making over about $200,000 was in that tax bracket. And when you think about who was making that kind of money back in that day, of course, Carnegie, Rockefeller, lots of people. But there was also an actor turned politician. Anybody remember this guy? Mr. Ronald Reagan, right? He was an actor turned politician. He actually, if you read his memoirs, his biographies, he talks about only doing 2 movies a year. He made about $100,000 per movie. So every dollar over $200,000, federal government kept 94 cents. He got to keep six. And truth be told, he didn't even get to keep the 6. And it wasn't Nancy either. It was the state of California. So literally didn't make sense for him to make any movies. Spent the rest of his time ranching and preparing to make movies the next year. That was a long time ago. How about the 70s, a little more recent? What is the worst it has ever been in the 70s? And this is pretty easy. This is easy to connect with. It's about 70% was the highest tax bracket in the 70s. Again, long time ago. How about today? What is the highest tax bracket today? The highest tax bracket today is 37%. So my question is, how does 37%, how does today stack up to some of those other numbers? Doesn't look too bad, does it? Which is interesting because I talk to people all over the country and I ask them all the time, how bad are taxes? And they always say things like, wow, it's never been worse, it's horrible, it's terrible. The reality, these are the best tax rates we've had in the last 80 years. And this concept of our taxes on sale might be a way to think about this. But the really important question that we have to ask ourselves is what's likely to happen to tax rates in the future? What's going to happen in 2026 and beyond? And many of us know that January 1st, 2026, our Trump tax breaks, tax credits, are going to repeal. Millions of Americans are going to be in a higher tax bracket, thus paying more tax. That is going to happen automatically if Congress does nothing, and we know Congress is pretty good at doing nothing. So what is likely going to happen to tax rates in the future? And I think it's going to be one of 3 things. They're either going to go up, they're going to go down, or they're going to stay the same, right? We don't really know what's going to happen, but what we can do is we can talk about the environment that the federal government is operating in today. And I love this little cartoon. We have the mom and dad out there saying, like the sign says, it's all theirs. Of course, it says the IRS put it together, theirs. I think that's a cute little cartoon, and it gets us to, we often feel that way, right? That the federal government sort of gets what they want. But when we really come down to it, the question really becomes, if for those of you that think tax rates are going to go higher, why? What will the federal government be spending money on that will force tax rates to go higher? And I think we can probably list out a whole bunch of things, right? We just had this pandemic come through. We've got debt, Medicare, we've got defense, Social Security, infrastructure, pension stimulus, healthcare, on and on and on. But if you look at that list and you could pick 2 on that list that overwhelmingly will be the 2 most expensive programs on that list, what do you think those 2 are? Social Security, and Medicare. So let's actually tackle Social Security. Let's take that a little bit deeper. And I think it's important to talk a little bit about what Social Security was and what it looks like today. When was Social Security first established? Many of us know that in 1935, the Roosevelt administration was part of the New Deal. And at that time, most of the elderly was in poverty. So this was a way to bring the elderly out of poverty. For how many people were contributing to the Social Security system for every one person pulling money out? That number was about 42 to 1. And how old did you need to be able to draw money out of the Social Security system back at that time? You had to be the age of 65. And if you're lucky enough to make it to 65, what was the average life expectancy? The average life expectancy was 62. And if you're lucky enough to make it to 62, how long would you draw? You would draw for about 2 years. That was the system in what it was, in how it was set up. Then something happened. What happened? Soldiers came back from the war and did something at a rate never seen before in this country. What was that? Making babies, right? So if we take a look at the last 5 demographic trends, or the demographic trends, we can see the different generations that we have in front of us, from the greatest generation, the Henry Ford generation, to the silent generation, to that statistical anomaly in the middle of baby boomers. If you're born between 1946 and 1964, you are a baby boomer. And there's almost 80 million baby boomers out there. Almost a quarter of the population is the baby boomers. And then the baby boomers had fewer children, right? Take a look at that. Much fewer, to the tune of about 30 million fewer kids. So now let's take a look at how does that impact Social Security today, and what does Social Security look like today? So how many workers are contributing to the Social Security system for every one person pulling money out? About 3 to 1 was 42, right? About 10 years from now, what does that look like? Actually, a touch over 2 to 1, contributing for every person pulling money out of the system. At what age can you start taking distributions from the Social Security system? It's actually 62. And for those that start drawing at 62, on average, how long do they draw before they tip over dead? Life expectancy, right? 23 years. And if you've heard me talk in the past, we talk about those that make it to age 62, husband, wife, there's a 50% chance one of those will live to 93. We're talking about potentially 30 years. Does the Social Security system look a little bit different today than when it was set up? When it was set up, it was meant to be a system to keep people out of poverty. Today, it's a pension plan for people for almost 25% or a quarter of their life. If you've heard me talk before, specifically about taxes, you've heard me talk about Mr. David Walker, the author of Come Back America. David Walker was a former Comptroller General of the United States, or federal government, under Clinton and Bush, so he was a nonpartisan kind of guy. And he was the head of the Government Accountability Office. That's who Congress and the President were accountable to. He was essentially the CPA of the federal government. He was on the board of Social Security, and on and on and on of the accolades for David Walker. David Walker wrote a book many years ago called Come Back America. And David Walker was also on NPR many years ago. He was sort of on the speaking tour, beating the drum of what's actually happening from a fiscal perspective. So this person knows the books better than anybody else. And he says, whoa, 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 we've promised way more than we can actually fulfill. The entitlement programs are fiscal cancer that's eating us from within. And if you think Social Security is bad, David Walker said Medicare's 5 times more expensive. He said in order to keep our promises, we need to double tax rates immediately. Double tax rates immediately. Cut expenses in half, or a combination of those. Well, we don't have to double tax rates immediately, but for every year we kick the can down the road, our debt will increase by $2 trillion a year until we get to $53 trillion. What's the magic number of 53 trillion? What's wrong with a country owing $53 trillion? It means that the revenue coming into the Treasury will only be enough to pay for the interest on the debt, let alone $1 for Social Security, Medicare, teachers, roads, or anything else. So David Walker, on his speaking tour, was speaking to NPR back in 2008, and he was sharing his view that tax rates need to double, and the host didn't necessarily agree. And David Walker said, I'll give you one four-letter word for why, or to explain why tax rates need to double. And the host couldn't get that four-letter word. They opened it up the phone lines to see if any of the listeners could pick out that four-letter word, and none of them could. And we're going to do a little poll to see if anybody knows the answer to that. So we've got if you saw the poll up there, again, we appreciate everybody joining in. So what was that four-letter word that David Walker said that was the reason why taxes need to double? And we'll get our answer here, our poll response shortly. But the four-letter word is math. Debt is exactly what I thought. Jobs, wars, yeah, there's a lot of four-letter words, but it's math. And what did David Walker mean? He said, if you have this much money coming in and you have this much money going out, it's just a math problem. He said we need to immediately double take tax rates or cut expenses in half or some combination of the two. So that's what David Walker talked about. So I want to pivot a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about a cartoon. I suspect some of the boomers that are on this call today have seen the Roadrunner, have fond memories of the Roadrunner. And who is the character that was always trying to kill the Roadrunner? Wile E. Coyote. All right, we remember this. And there was an episode where Wile E. Coyote was building a bomb. And who was the bomb made by? Acme, if we remember that. And he was building it in a shed. And the shed also was built by Acme. And Wile E. Coyote was so focused on building the bomb, he had no idea that the Roadrunner pushed the shed up onto a train track. And so the Wile E. Coyote was so focused on what was happening, he also didn't realize that there was a huge train bearing down on him. So I think the most important question I'm going to ask today, if you were on a train track with a freight train bearing down on you, what would you do? You'd probably get off the track, right? Well, I think that's very interesting because there was this article in the USA Today that talked about a man from the far west, Utah, managed to bail out his car that was stuck on a railroad commuter track before the vehicle was struck by a commuter train at 55 miles per hour. Danny Olson, 62, said he took a wrong turn and got his 1998 Nissan Sentra stuck between the rails Monday evening. Now here's the important point. This is what I want you to listen to. When he saw the train lights approaching in his rearview mirror, he decided to get out of his car. Is that a good idea? That was a good idea. Now, let's go back to Wile E. Coyote. Wile E. Coyote on the train track saw the freight train coming down, and what did Wile E. Coyote do? He pulled the window shade down, thinking the act of doing so would make the problem go away. Did the problem go away? The problem didn't go away. And of course, there's a huge explosion. Does Wile E. Coyote ever die? No, he never really dies. It's a little frustrating. But as the smoke and fire cleared, Wile E. Coyote was limping off, worse for the wear. Now, why do I share that cartoon or illustration with you? Because we as typical Americans saving in traditional tax-deferred investments, 401ks, IRAs, are on the railroad tracks with a giant freight train bearing down on us. And we really have a couple different options. Number one, we can put our head in the sand. We can pretend that the math that David Walker talked about isn't true. It doesn't add up. But isn't that a little bit like pulling that window shade down and pretending the problem isn't there? The second option we have is we can put strategies and tactics in place today to help guard us and insulate us upon the future tax rate problems that we might incur. And that's really what we're going to spend our time today talking a little bit about those strategies of what we should do. So as a normal American, we have lots of different investment options available to us, but we can take those tens of thousands of investments and boil it down into three basic types of investments. Those three basic types of investments, we'll call buckets of money today, are taxable. And if we think about taxable means our investment grows, and as we grow that money, we have to pay a portion of that back to the IRS. Well, what are some common taxable accounts? And we see the first one up there, savings account, CDs, money markets, stocks and bonds, mutual funds. Those are going to be common taxable investments. Now, how do we know that our investment is a taxable investment? We receive this thing called the 1099, and that's a little love letter from the financial institution saying, you made this much money, you need to pay a portion of that back in tax. So essentially, the growth is all taxable. So if it's all taxable, why do we even have those kind of accounts? We have those kind of accounts because generally speaking, those accounts are very liquid. What do we mean by liquid? It means easily accessible. And why is that important? It makes a very strong emergency fund. Now, we've heard financial experts for years agree upon a specific number that they feel we should have in our emergency account. That number is about 6 months of basic living expenses. That's one of a few numbers that financial experts can actually agree upon. But from a tax perspective, can you have too much money in a taxable account? Absolutely. Can you also have too little in that account from an emergency perspective? Absolutely. So what we are looking for is we're looking for the perfect amount of money. And the perfect amount of money is about 6 months of basic living expenses. Bucket number one. Bucket number two is our tax-deferred bucket. That's where we put money in and we're simply deferring to some point in the future to pay taxes at the appropriate rates. Now, what are some common tax-deferred accounts? 401ks, IRAs, 403bs, annuities. Those are some common accounts that fit in the deferred bucket. Now, all of these have maybe slightly different rules to them, but they basically have two things in common. Number one is, generally speaking, you get a tax deduction. That means if you made $100,000 and you put $10,000 into your 401k, your taxable income would go down to $90,000. So that's a tax deduction. The second thing that most of these investments have in common is the manner for how money is distributed out of these accounts. This money that comes out of these accounts has a very important name or a very important word in the IRS tax code. They're called ordinary income. And what that simply means is you pay taxes at whatever rate tax rates are when you pull the money out. So what's interesting about that is I always say that when you're in those tax-deferred accounts, it's kind of like you're in a business partnership with the IRS, where the IRS gets to vote each and every year how much of your money they get to keep. Now, does that sound like a good business partnership to you? Not necessarily. And if you have $1 million in a tax-deferred account, do you really know how much you have? Unless you can accurately predict exactly what tax rates are when you pull distributions out, do you really know how much is in that IRA account? Is it a little hard to do retirement planning when you really don't know how much is in that account? Absolutely. The third bucket is tax-free. Sometimes it's called tax advantage. There's all kinds of different terms. We like tax-free. It just sort of rolls off the tongue. And we know in tax-free that we have two main requirements to truly be tax-free. And the first one is we want it to be free of all forms of tax, federal tax, state tax, and capital gains tax. And the second test that we're looking for is we want to make sure that income off this bucket does not impact our Social Security being taxed. And if you've caught our Social Security timing workshop, we talk a lot about provisional income and how Social Security is potentially taxed. So for us to truly be tax-free, you need to satisfy all of those requirements. And there's a lot of things that masquerade out there as tax-free. One of those examples is municipal bonds. Many of us have heard of municipal bonds. Our municipal bonds, we were always told municipal bonds are tax-free. Well, they are tax-free from a federal perspective. But from a state, if I live in Minnesota and buy a municipal bond in North Dakota, is my state of Minnesota going to give me a credit for supporting that municipality? No, I don't get the state deduction. How about I diversify and buy a basket, a mutual fund of municipal bonds? If that basket grows and I sell, do I pay capital gains on that municipal bond fund? Absolutely. So two of the three requirements of being tax-free are not even satisfied with municipal bonds. Add to that is the interest that comes off of municipal bonds. Does that go towards that provisional income test to see if my Social Security is taxed? Yes, it does. So what we've often heard was a tax-free vehicle being municipal bonds fails the test that we put out there for tax-free. So the question is, what are those benefits? Well, what are those options? We're going to talk about that here moving forward. And I'm going to share an example, and I want to share an example to help encapsulate some different ideas and how we think about putting together the Power of Zero strategy. And I'm going to share this, and I don't want anybody to tune out because the numbers have either 1 0 more than you do or 1 0 less than you do. I don't want you to tune it out because the person's 10 years younger than you or 10 years older. I think this story is going to have something for everybody. So our couple here, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, and they're 49 and 50 years old. Their household income is about $100,000, and they are planning on retiring at age 65. Okay, we remember there's three kinds of buckets, right? Taxable, tax-deferred, and tax-free. Well, let's take a look at what they have. Well, first and foremost, they have an IRA worth $500,000. Which bucket does the IRA go into? The tax-deferred, right? They also have mutual funds, and they have $100,000 in mutual funds. Now, where does mutual funds, which bucket does that go into? The taxable bucket, right? They're contributing to a 401k, but in this situation, there's no match. Where does 401k go into which bucket? Tax deferred. In addition to those investments, they also own a little bit of term life insurance, and they're thinking about long-term care insurance. So that's Mr. and Mrs. Jones. So when we take a look at this, what I think is interesting is when a consumer like this sits down and talks to a typical tax-deferred planning financial advisor, the story typically looks like this. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, you have $500,000 in that IRA. You did 7% last year. We think we probably could have done a little better. We probably could have got you about 8. We'd like you to move that money over to us. Sound familiar? Those mutual funds you have, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, you did 3% last year. We think we could have got you 5. Again, move that money over to us. Next, they say, well, you're contributing to the 401k. Well, we might as well just continue doing that. And then lastly is the life insurance and long-term care. That's not something we normally do, so who are we to tell you not to do it? Does that sound familiar? That's what a lot of consumers run into when dealing with traditional tax-deferred financial planning. There's nothing wrong with that, but when people typically walk in our office, it looks like this. We see red flag, red flag, red flag, and red flag. And we'll talk about why. Let's start with that IRA first. Now, that the amount in the IRA is not what concerns me. What keeps me up at night in this situation is what's going to happen to that IRA over the next 15 years. If it grows at 8%, what is that $500,000 IRA today going to be worth? $1.6 million. What's wrong with having $1.6 million in an IRA? Taxes. The required minimum distribution alone is going to put this consumer, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, in one of the top tax brackets alone. That's a problem. So the question is, I think we're going to do a poll question here as well. The question is, how do we prevent an IRA from growing? We're going to have some fun with this. We've got some cute answers, I believe, but how do you prevent an IRA for growing. If you could go ahead and share your confidential thought on this, we appreciate it. We're having some fun with the poll questions. And we will put up the answers here any moment. Usually when I start the next segment is usually when the poll answers come up. So I'll give it just a moment. There we go. Shift to tax-free. Absolutely. Invest in the market. Thank you, people, for not answering. That's sort of the sarcastic answer. Give the money to a favorite kid. Maybe depends who the kid is. But the answer is shifting that money into tax-free. Again, thank you, everybody, for participating in our polls. We hope you enjoyed those. This is often a situation where I'll get somebody to raise their hand and say, well, do a Roth conversion. That's one thing you can do to shift to tax-free. And if you attended our Roth conversion workshop last month, you learned lots of stuff about Roth conversions. If you didn't, you'll have a chance to catch that recording later. So let's take a look at how Roth conversion might look for Mr. and Mrs. Jones. Well, we know with a Roth conversion, it allows you to shift money from tax deferred to tax free. But you do have to pay taxes on that money. So let's just assume Mr. and Mrs. Jones then are at the 40% tax rate on that $500,000. How much do they pay on that $500,000 IRA? $200,000 in taxes. Do Mr. and Mrs. Jones have $200,000 just laying around waiting to pay taxes? No, they don't. Some people say, well, let's just pay the tax out of the IRA. What's the problem with that? If you're under 59.5, that's an early distribution penalty of 10%. Not only will the IRS take your $200,000 of tax, they'll throw a penalty on top. That's not a great idea. So doing a full Roth conversion for Mr. and Mrs. Jones might not be the optimal solution. Here, I might introduce a concept that is a little known code in the tax code. It's called the 72 subset T, or we affectionately refer to that as the 72T. What is 72T? It allows the consumers, us, to take equal distributions on an annual basis before 59.5. We do have to pay taxes, but there's no penalty. That 10% penalty is gone. The only caveat is those distributions need to continue for a minimum of 5 years or to the age 59.5, whichever is longer. Currently, for Mr. and Mrs. Jones, who's age 50, that distribution rate is about 5% for easy math. So let's go back to our story. So on that IRA that's worth $500,000, if we take 5% of that, that means we could use 72T and we could shift $25,000 to tax-free. The mutual funds. What's the problem with mutual funds? What is the ideal amount that we want to have in a taxable account? 50 is 6 months of basic living expenses. If they make $100,000, our ideal amount is about $50,000. So with growth in over the next 15 years, trying to get that $100,000 down to the optimal level, I've done the math already. We need to shift $6,000 per year to tax-free. How about that 401k? How do we feel about a 401k without a match? What do most financial experts say? Contribute to the match, not a penny more. After that, you look at alternative options. So we don't love the option of continuing to contribute to a traditional tax-deferred 401k without a match, especially if we're doing a 72T where we're pulling money out. We have conflicting strategies in that case. So what do? Is we want to shift that $10,000 over to tax-free as well. How do we feel about term life insurance and long-term care? We think they're extremely important to mitigating risk. But we think that maybe there's a better strategy for allocating those dollars. So we're going to reposition those dollars into tax-free as well. So if we add all that money up, we get $47,000 that we feel that we can shift over to tax-free. Now, this is usually where somebody says, whoa, 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 Mike, not so fast. We don't really have $47,000. to shift. And I say, what do you mean? They said, well, we've got a couple taxable events going on, right? Because if we're taking money out of the IRA, that's a taxable event. And how about that 401k? If we're not contributing to the 401k, then that means our income's not reduced. So we've got an extra $35,000 there that's going to be added to income. So they were absolutely correct. So if we do the math, that $35,000 of additional income in 30% tax bracket, that means Mr. and Mrs. Jones will have about $10,500 more in taxes this year. Now, how do Mr. and Mrs. Jones like it when I say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, we're not going to take the vacation, we're going to tighten the belt, not go out to eat? Do you think they're going to return my call? Probably not. So it's really important for us to find ways to help them pay that tax. So let's go back to those numbers. We know that $47,000 was how much we wanted to shift to tax-free. We'll subtract out that $10,000. It means we have a little over $36,000 that we can shift to tax-free. So that's the first step in the process, is figure out how much you can shift towards tax-free. Now, what are some ideas of what we might do? Is we want to go and utilize some of the tools that are out there for tax-free. Now, I'm not able to get into all of those today. We'll list those a little bit later, but we're going to talk about a couple. And the first one we're going to talk about is one of our favorites, which is a Roth IRA. And most of us know about Roth IRAs these days. If you're over 59 and a half, the account's been set up for at least 5 years, all the distributions are tax-free. And I put up there tax-free from what we talked about earlier: federal tax, state tax, capital gains tax, and the income does not impact the provisional income. That's the test to see if my Social Security is taxed. So it truly is tax-free. Now, how much can I put into the Roth IRA? If I'm under 50, I can put in $6,000. If I'm over 50, I can put in $7,000. Okay, so let's go back and we take a look at this. So we know we want to shift $36,500, and we're going to take that $13,000 that we just put into the Roth IRA out of there. So now how much do we have left to shift? About $23,500. So the question is, what are we going to shift it into? And again, there's a lot of things, but what I might introduce here is a part of the tax code that we haven't talked about yet today. And this tax code creates a bucket. And this bucket allows us to put money in, grow money, and ultimately the rules are slightly different. Here are the rules in this part of the tax code. Number one is there is no prepayment penalty. If you take money out before 59 and a half, you do not have to pay that 10% penalty. Unlike my Roth or my IRA and my 401k. I don't receive any 1099s, so as that money grows, I'm not paying tax. And when I'm taking distributions out, it's tax-free. It's off the radar of the IRS if it's done appropriately. In addition to that, there's no contribution limits. What did we say was the maximum you could put into the Roth IRA? $7,000 per person. We've got people that put in $50 a month and people that put in $200,000 a year into this kind of strategy. No contribution limits. In addition to that, there's no income limitations as well. Can Bill Gates contribute to a Roth IRA? Nope. If you're making as a household, I guess he's single now, but as a household, over about $215,000 modified adjusted gross income, you cannot contribute to a Roth IRA. This bucket, Bill Gates and any other wealthy human can contribute as well. And there's not enough emphasis put on this, but I think as we think about things moving forward, this concept around legislative risk really makes this concept make a lot of sense. In my last few months of talking about taxes, I've talked about all the different ways that Congress and the IRS is changing the rules when it comes to saving for retirement and the integration of a lot of taxes. Well, one thing about this bucket is when things have changed, which there were changes in 1982, 84, 1988, there's a grandfathering of any of these buckets that were set up prior to. And what that grandfather clause said is if you set this up before the change, you can keep contributing to it, same rules. So what happens is if there's any changes that happen moving forward, we know and feel very confident that all the rules in the tax code that we just referred to will stay the same. But there is a cost of admission, because what happens when I go through this with people, they say, this sounds fantastic. Why haven't I ever heard of this before? Let's put all of our money in there. Now, first off, is it ever a good idea to put all your eggs in one basket? No. Moreover, there's a cost of admission, and you can see the spigot. And there's a cost that comes out of this, and that cost is in the form of term insurance, or the cost of insurance. Those are the costs. Now, if I'm talking to Mr. and Mrs. Jones who are 50 years old, their home is almost paid for, the kids are maybe out of the house, are Mr. and Mrs. Jones excited about their term insurance and keeping life insurance? Maybe not. And this is the time in life where a lot of people are dropping their term insurance. And companies that create these products understand that. And they're really trying to sweeten the pot. And by that, I mean what these companies are doing is they have the term insurance, but now what they're trying to do is utilize that death benefit to help pay for long-term care or long-term care insurance. And this is where a lot of dollars are moving towards this type of chastity. We know in October, by the way, we're going to have a workshop on long-term care hybrids. We will talk more in depth about these type of solutions. But quite simply, if we have a $400,000 death benefit life insurance policy, it pays 2% per month for long-term care, or $8,000 a month for long-term care for 4 years. That is very compelling, especially compared to, if any of you have looked at long-term care insurance, it's not inexpensive, is it? In addition to that, let's say you keep paying on long-term care for 20 years and you tip over dead, does that insurance company send you a check back? No, they keep that in the fund to pay for the other people that need long-term care, right? That creates a lot of unrest and anxiety for people. And this strategy, if you tip over dead never needing long-term care insurance, this death benefit's paid out tax-free to your beneficiaries. And that's a reason why a lot of people are moving long-term care insurance to this type of chastity. Now, what do we call this bucket is the question. Now, we call this bucket a LIRP, L-I-R-P, and the L-I stands for life insurance and the R-P stands for retirement plan. Remember, the cost of insurance or the cost of administration is life insurance. There's a small amount of life insurance, but there's a giant bucket of tax-free money that we can accumulate to supplement our incomes when tax rates go up in the future. So, as I said, maybe we'd introduce this concept. Now, maybe we would take a portion, we'll use the whole thing for discussion purposes today, but now we've got a bucket that can absorb all $23,000 that we wanted to shift into tax-free. Okay, I want to ask a really important question. What is the perfect tax bracket? We're not going to do a poll question on this, I don't think, and I don't think this is a trick question. I think for most of us, the perfect tax bracket is 0. So let's see how we're actually doing for Mr. and Mrs. Jones. So we know we contributed $13,000 to a Roth IRA, right? We know as long as the money's in there till 59.5, been in there 5 years, that money's going to come out tax-free. Will not impact Social Security. We talked about the LIRP, or the LIRP. We know that money that we're going to stuff in for the next 15 years is going to come out income tax-free or tax-free as well. So we're doing good so far, but now we got this IRA that we got to deal with, right? And what did we say earlier? That we didn't want that IRA to grow. And many people said we need to shift that money to tax-free. So we use the 72T to keep that $500,000 from growing to $1.6 million. Because if that $1.6 million is there, Social Security is going to be taxable forever, and they're going to be in the highest tax bracket. So we want to do that 72T. Now, what does that do is it basically maintained that IRA. So for discussion purposes, we have $500,000 still sitting in the IRA. Can we get money out of that IRA tax-free? It's not a poll question. Can we get money out of that IRA tax-free legally? The answer is perhaps. So let's go in and talk about deductions. Many of us know about standard deductions. Now, first off, if I could just have a caveat to the deduction conversation, most retirees pay more in taxes in part because their deductions go down. Why? Because the number one deduction most people have is their mortgage interest. That goes away. Contributions to 401ks go away. There's a number of things. Charitable contributions often go to more volunteering versus writing checks. So what happens for a lot of retirees is they go from itemizing their deductions down to the standard deduction. So anyway, the standard deduction in 2022 is $25,900. Generally, that standard deduction is inflated. So in 15 years for Mr. and Mrs. Jones, we're going to guess that maybe the standard deduction is $37,400. And what does that mean? It means that all the income they have from whatever sources, if it's under $37,400, that money is tax-free. So if we pull less than $37,400 out of the IRA, that comes out tax-free as well. So now our IRA distributions are tax-free. And if all that's tax-free, Roth, the LIRP, the IRA, that means our Social Security is likely to be tax-free as well. Tax-free, 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 and tax-free. How does that look? It looks pretty good. Now this is really important. How does second place look? Does anybody know what the next tax rate is up from 0? On the federal side, it's 10. And let's just add 5 for simplicity for state. Together, it's 15%. What if David Walker was right and the math that he talked about is correct and the federal government is forced to double tax rates? Now what happens? Second place doesn't look so great, does it? There's multiple streams of tax-free income. And one thing that I want to make sure comes across clear is this is not dump everything into one strategy kind of strategy. We are huge advocates of multiple streams of tax-free income. And we've talked about some of these, but this is a list of things that we would typically use when having a Power of Zero consultation. The Roth IRA that we spoke of, the Roth 401k potentially Roth conversions, the LIRP, health savings accounts, potentially reverse mortgages, the IRAs underneath the standard deduction, right? There's some strategy, and if we can keep that threshold for provisional income at a level, our Social Security may be tax-free as well. So this is the point where I usually get 2 questions. And the first question I normally get is something along the lines of, if I pay nothing in taxes, am I really a good citizen? Am I really a good patriot if I'm not paying taxes? Well, remember, this is not a tax avoidance strategy. This is a tax today strategy. If we feel that taxes are on sale today, if we pay at a lower rate today than what it might be in the future, that's not necessarily a problem. And Judge Hand, who was a famous judge who never became a Supreme Court justice, had this quote that I like. It said, "Anyone may arrange his affairs so that his taxes shall be as low as possible. He is not bound to choose that pattern which pays best the Treasury. There's not even a patriotic duty to increase one's taxes." Over and over, the courts have said that there is nothing sinister in so arranging affairs as to keep taxes as low as possible. Everyone does it, rich and poor alike, and all do right. For nobody owes any public duty to pay more than the law demands. So what's Judge Hand saying? He said you can still be a patriot because the strategy, again, is a pay today strategy. I'll get to the second question here in a moment. But we always want to finish our workshops by making sure that we can provide resources so you can have some follow-up discussions and information. So the first thing we have is we have copies of the Power of Zero book. This presentation came from the book Power of Zero by Mr. David McKnight. So we are giving away to those that are interested a copy of the Power of Zero book. The second thing we're offering is a Power of Zero consultation. Remember, we talked about the traditional tax-deferred consultation. The Power of Zero consultation helps us figure out strategies of generating as much tax-free income and trying to get to the 0% tax bracket. In addition to that, we always offer up our recordings, our summer series. You can see our series, whether it's today's or any of the other workshops we have done this summer. So if you want any of that information, you can go ahead and chat. You can either chat whatever you think is helpful. You can put book in there, you can put consultation, you can put recordings, whatever's easy for you, or all of the above. We will make sure that we follow up with you and get you the information that you are looking for. If you prefer not to chat and just send an email, you can send me an email as well, and we'll make sure that we get you that information. So feel free to take a picture of the screen so you can capture that information. I'll leave that up there for just a second before I close things off and we ultimately move towards Q&A. The second question that I get is, am I too old to do this? And I think that's a really interesting question, because if you tell me the day you're going to die, I'll probably tell you the best way to go. That's a really hard question to answer, but I think if you're sitting here in 2030 and beyond, are you going to look back on 2022 and say, I wish I would have done something? I knew tax rates were on sale then. I wish I would have done something. If that's you, then it's likely doing something today, even something, makes a ton of sense. Okay, we're going to close down with the takeaways. These are the things that hopefully you took away from today's conversations. Tax rates are likely to be not only higher, but dramatically higher. If David Walker's correct and tax rates have to double in the future, those tax rates are higher dramatically. And there's only one way to fully insulate ourselves from that increase, and that's to get to zero, because doubling tax rates of zero, 2 times 0 is 0, right? What did we say, second place? Maybe not so good. Number 3, as I stated earlier, it's not just doing one of these things. Multiple streams of tax-free income is the secret sauce to the Power of Zero strategy. And lastly, remember, we have the saying, taxes are on sale. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. But January 1st, 2026, it's likely that the tax rates are going to repeal back, and millions of us Americans are going to move into a higher tax bracket and pay more in taxes. Okay, now what we're going to do is we are going to flip back and go for our Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. We are excited to have you and all of our experts join us. As you walk on over, I want to just remind all of our audience to ask their questions by using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Send them to hosts and panelists. We'll make sure we respond to those at the end of the presentation. This also allows anyone who may need to leave at 3 to hear the entire presentation, because sometimes we do go a little bit beyond that. Again, the recordings will be available for people who would like to catch up further later. As we're giving you a little time to put those questions into the chat, I do want to touch base a little bit on the various alma maters. I know that Wisconsin's had some big wins recently. I'm checking the records, and it looks like New Mexico State was a big win. That must have felt very, very good. Not too long before that, there was another big win against Illinois State. Again, something to really rally around. But I also see there's a big game coming up here very soon against the Ohio State. How are you feeling
Yeah,
about your Badgers this year?
Thanks for not bringing up Washington State from last week, right?
It's a gift.
That was
It's
an
a gift.
ugly game, but I love to see the Gopher Badger rivalry. I'm not excited about the Ohio State game. Ohio State's got our number. They will probably throttle us, but I like to see what the Gophers are doing. The Gophs are looking good. They're playing well, so I'm in fear of the Gophers this year, unfortunately. But thanks for bringing that up.
We are due for a year. I hope it turns out that way. I genuinely do. Those of you who know me well also know that my kids are all in Loon gear. So I do love my alma mater, but I have moved forward a little bit, and I bring these things up because they're fun. So I hope you enjoyed that as well. We did get a number of questions, and I think we've got some more rolling in as well, and I'm going to let them finish editing those and transcribing those so that we can figure out where best to put them as we're going through this. But a couple of the questions were specifically about company, employer, retiree plans. And one of those questions was, my company offers a Roth 401k. Do you recommend that I contribute to that?
Absolutely. We love Roth 401ks. There's so many, like we talked about, Josh, there's several different tax-free income streams. The Roth feature is becoming more and more popular inside 401ks. If we had this conversation 5 years ago, there's very few companies that have the Roth 401k feature, but we love the Roth 401k feature.
I happen to have the good fortune to work at a company who offers one of those.
Smart.
And one of the things that I'd like to credit my wife for that, encouraging me to apply for that job. But one of the things that I've noticed, and perhaps this is true at other plans as well, but when you get matching funds in those, it does not seem that the matching funds go into a Roth type account. Could you speak to that at all?
Nope, that's a great question. We talked about trying to really keep that IRA at $500,000 for Mr. and Mrs. Jones, right? So all matching contributions are tax deferred. So our contribution as employees are always going to go in tax-free if we choose the Roth feature, but the matching will be taxable, or tax-deferred, excuse me.
And does that tend to just be something that you manage, or does that tend to be one of those red flags and a problem of some sort?
No, you still want to take advantage of it, right? When we talk about the rules of thumb is always contribute and get the match. And we may get this question. We seem like we always get this question. It's important to talk about, too, is that match is there as long as you are vested, right? And so there's usually a little calculation in there that says, okay, we're going to give you this particular match, but if you leave after 1 year, you get nothing. If you leave after year 2, you get 20%, some version of that. That's really important because there's people that are in jobs, right? We hear about the great resignation going on that don't plan on being there, so that matching contribution may not actually be there because of the vesting schedule. So that's always a challenge to say, okay, do you see yourself with that company for 3 years? But if you know in your heart you're not going to be there, that's kind of like not having a matching contribution in your 401k.
We had another question about 401ks and retirement planning with employers that's, I think, kind of a variation on what we've been talking about. So I know at many employers, it is routine to offer a match. I understand that there are some financial incentives for employers to do that. And there's some means testing and some top-heavy testing and some other things, which I may have just mislabeled. Again, I'm a recovering financial advisor. Is it true that there are some plans that don't offer matching? And if so, I know you addressed this partially in your presentation, but how big of a deal does that make when I'm determining whether or not to contribute and take advantage of that plan?
So the question is, are there a lot of companies that don't provide match? Surprisingly so.
Really?
Surprisingly so. I'd be making up a number, but I've heard something, I think in that 20 to 30% range.
Wow.
So more than you'd think. But what's also interesting is companies change their match. 2008, when that came about, right, that was a tough time, and companies were just trying to stay afloat. One of the first things that a lot of companies did would remove the match, or certainly lowered that match. So, like we said, if there's a match, there's an incentive to be there. If there's no match, I'm thinking about how do I reposition that, right? Now, remember, what I'm talking about is traditional tax-deferred contributions. right? If this 401k Joshua has a Roth feature, okay, that's still Roth money. That's still going into tax-free. So I still like that.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned that at the end, because I think that's a distinction people might miss, right? Is even without the match, if it's a Roth, it may still be wise to put it in there and take advantage of that.
And if I could emphasize one thing, Joshua, that you got me thinking of. And we tried to set the presentation up to really line up with this, is the way you start this is you figure out how much money are you contributing to stuff, right? In all that money you're contributing, try to put it in those buckets, and then figure out how much you can potentially shift towards tax-free. So you start with sort of that big number first. Once you have that big number, we talked about that 47,000, the 36,000 number, then you take a look at all the alternatives that are out there, right? You look at, if I've got a Roth 401k, you look at the Roth IRA, you look at the conversion, you look at the LIRP, you look at the HSA, you look at all of those. But start with really the big number first, and then you start to prioritize which tax-free buckets you should look at.
So let's kind of bring together something you just mentioned, the HSA, employer benefits plans, and employer benefits plans can work a lot of different ways, and sometimes people certainly do this on their own, right? But that HSA, sometimes an employer is going to contribute to it, sometimes you're contributing it to yourself. How do you feel like that fits into the broader discussion of power of zero and tax planning for retirement?
We love it. We love the health savings account. We think it's one of the best investments because it's triple tax exempt, right? You get a deduction going in, grows tax deferred, and when it comes out, as long as it's used for medical reasons, it's tax free. Nothing on the planet has triple tax benefits. Everything else has at best 2. This has 3, so we love it. We think the HSA is a tremendous tool, especially within the power of zero paradigm that we talked about as well.
That is fantastic, and for people who
Anything
have been,
else to add to that? I'm sorry, but this is your sweet spot, Joshua. Is there anything else to add to that?
we did become big fans of HSAs a long time ago, and one of the most striking statistics that we talked to our Medicare clients about, right, is what is the expected lifetime cost of health care for a couple turning 65. And not that long ago, when I got into this business, which I guess is getting to be longer ago than I care to admit, you know, it was around 200 grand. Just a few years ago, before COVID and everything, we were talking about 250,000. Now we're starting to talk about $300,000 of lifetime healthcare costs. That's a lot of money that has to come from somewhere, and that if it's not planned for, will in fact be after-tax dollars, right? And how much more do you have to have 300 grand after tax? So yes, we are big fans of that, and if you can take advantage of that, it definitely should be a part of your discussion and your plan with your professional. When we're talking about this, and now we're starting to really talk about different buckets, how many buckets does somebody need to have a plan, right? Can they do it in one bucket? Do they need every bucket?
We are huge proponents of lots of options. We like to see multiple options because they all do things a little bit different. They all sort of do things a little bit better depending on what you're trying to accomplish, and you just don't know what the future looks like. So having as many buckets as you can, we think is a huge advantage. So we love to, if we do have the opportunity to have all 8 buckets, we certainly, there's nothing wrong with that. We do prefer more buckets than fewer buckets. We don't love the strategy of putting everything in one, like the LIRP, right? That is a tool, is a solution. We don't feel like one of those strategies is the best way to do it.
That's important context, and my guess is even within that answer, it will vary based on someone's individual situation, what's available from their employer, and perhaps other factors as well.
100%.
Super. So I've got a couple questions about the LIRP. I'm not sure everyone was familiar with that going into this presentation, and I know that even having heard about it a few times, it's still sometimes an idea that's confusing to me, and I certainly hadn't thought about it before in terms of long-term care. Could you speak to the LIRP and how it may or may not play a role in paying for or planning for long-term care?
Sure. LIRPs have been around a long time. There's so many different kinds of life insurance. That's the hard part is people have stereotypes and stigmas, and it's really specifically designed to build cash that's a tax-free distribution. I often tell people I own multiple LIRPs, right? And I've been in this business 27 years, and I'd argue I understand this stuff pretty well, and I own it. And because all of the benefits that are out there, Joshua, and the long-term care piece has become where a lot of people are looking at really transferring that long-term care risk, right? We've had lots of conversations about long-term care. And a lot of people really, as I talked about, get that heartburn. When they pay for something, they're like, I hope I never use this, right? And so knowing that the dollars that they're putting into this, they're either going to get some kind of a benefit because, to your point a few minutes ago, the drastic cost of healthcare, or if they tip over dead due to a natural cause, somebody's going to get something from it. So it's in a lot of times, I find in financial planning, when people get to retirement, when they can use a tool like that Swiss Army knife that can do multiple things, it gives so much flexibility. That's what's really cool about the LIRP, is it does a lot of things really, really well. And now we add long-term care. This has been a real evolution of long-term care over the last probably 10 to 15 years, where, again, more and more is moving to that chassis.
So let's maybe follow up on that a little bit, because I think people always have to buy what's available to them at the time that they're making that evaluation and making that decision. And it definitely seems that some of those products are becoming more popular for people who are making this decision for the first time. What are people who maybe made a decision in the past and have an existing long-term care policy in place doing? Is that still something they're talking about? Or is it more a situation where I dealt with that problem 3 years, 5 years, 10 years ago, I don't need to worry about that anymore?
No, I think that's an excellent question. I appreciate you bringing that up, because long-term care, if somebody has a long-term care policy, it is a valuable insurance plan. You can't get a long-term care policy today for what you bought a policy for 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So even though I used the example, it said, okay, take that $4,000, maybe put it towards the LIRP. That's where somebody's maybe thinking about it. If somebody has long-term care insurance, do not drop it and take that money and put it towards a LIRP. I'm anti that. Now, if somebody's going to drop it regardless, then reposition that money. But maybe on top of that is I too own long-term care insurance. But I think what happens is when those of us that own long-term care insurance, we can only transfer so much risk with long-term care insurance. So it's nice to have sort of phase one, which is a pure risk management play of long-term care. And now I have my LIRP, or my permanent life insurance, on top of that, Joshua. So now I got phase two in place, because I know that long-term care bill is going to be an expensive bill. So that's a nice way of layering long-term care planning versus buying a second long-term care policy. So that's really where we'll use maybe that LIRP and tie that together with an existing long-term care policy. Again, combination of things. Now that LIRP handles multiple things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's long been, for me and for many of the people that I talk to on the health insurance side, is one of the most complicated things, is how all the different pieces interlock. And what I'm learning, hearing you and some of our other speakers present to our audience, right, is that health insurance isn't the only complicated thing out there, right, where there are multiple different factors that have to be weighed out in order to make good decisions. So that's fantastic advice. Thank you for that. Another question that we got from our audience, and I want to just say that I'm not entirely sure which he's getting at here, so maybe you can answer this two different ways. Okay. I'm older than 59 and a half. Talk about IRA conversion costs to a Roth account. And I'm thinking perhaps there's the tax part, which you spent some time about, but maybe you could revisit. But are there other costs?
Costs, okay. Mm-hmm. So first off, we had a great Roth conversion workshop last month, so make sure you chat. We'll get you the recording from last month. So the cost to a Roth conversion is the only cost from going from an IRA to tax-free is the tax. That's the only cost. Now, depending on what kind of investment you're using that situation, Joshua, if you buy a specific stock or mutual fund or something like that, that particular product may have a cost, but doing Roth conversion from IRA to Roth IRA, the only cost is tax.
Is the tax.
Hopefully I answered that.
Okay, and we'll certainly continue to monitor the chat if our answer there was not clear and it didn't provide you with everything. You're also welcome to, and I'd encourage you to, if you have specific questions, to reach out to Mike directly. I know that we've had his information up on the screen before, and that will also be available again at the very end of the presentation. Well, there may be one or two more. I'm going to ask our staff to just do a quick double check and confirm whether or not we have any other questions before we wrap it up. But are there any other final thoughts, things you want to add for our audience as perhaps a parting word?
Yeah, I think maybe the two things that probably can be emphasized is, number one, is remember the power of zero planning it's just a little bit different than what we've done in the past. It's not right or wrong, good or bad, but really starts, the first question you need to ask yourself is, do you truly believe tax rates are going to go higher in the future? If you don't think they are, you're probably not on this call, but if you don't think they're going to go higher, some of the power of zero stuff might not be the strategy you use, and that's okay. I think the second part that's along those same lines, Joshua, is it's a little bit different than the old ways of doing things, and we all get stuck in our ways. And we're all guilty of this, right? And just because these are things that maybe mom and dad didn't do, or my cousin that's really smart doesn't do, doesn't mean these aren't great ideas, right? And again, I compliment everybody for taking the time to learn about this stuff, right? And to hopefully make the right decisions for yourself. And the other part of that, the last part, is you don't have to implement everything. Do one or two things this year. And then read the book and just keep learning about it. Maybe do one or two things next year, right? And pretty soon you do little things and you got a whole bunch of money sitting in tax-free. And I promise you, when you get to the point of distributions, you are going to be so happy you've got a big bucket of tax-free money.
You know, I think that's a fantastic way to finish. Do a little bit and keep growing. That's fantastic advice. Thank you very much to everyone for attending Alexander and Haberman's Summer Speaker Series and today's presentation, The Power of Zero. A special thanks especially to Mike Becker of Legacy Financial Partners and all of our team that makes this possible. Aaron for running today's technology, Caleb, Brittany, Zena, Christian, Jackie, Nicole, and Beth as well. If you would like to suggest a topic for a future workshop or interact with any of our hosts or guests, please email workshops@mnhealthagents.com. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel to get the latest content. Alexander and Haberman is a specialty firm focused on assisting with Medicare Advantage, supplements, and Part D plans, as well as individual and family health insurance on and off the exchange, and other benefits, including health, dental, and vision.